Welcome to Her Story, the history of Southeast Asia told from her perspective. We'll discover historical figures, matriarchal societies, and contemporary female icons, and maybe learn about ourselves along the way. I'm your host, AJ Miras. This is part two of us revisiting the Minangkabau Matrilineal Society. In the previous episode, we talked about Ruhana Kuddus, Indonesia's first female journalist. In this episode, we're going to talk about Soenting Melajoe, the pioneering indigenous women's newspaper published from 1912 to 1921 in the Minangkabau community in West Sumatra. Research and writing for this episode was in collaboration with Joanna Que, with additional research by AJ Miras-Guevarra. If you haven't listened to episode 25 yet, go check that out first, as we'll be referencing that here. From 1900 to 1942, there were 209 newspapers published by and for the Minangkabau communities of West Sumatra. 8 of those newspapers were managed by women and published stories about women's issues, many of them tackling gender inequality. These newspapers became a vehicle for the feminist movement in the Minangkabau region and a way for women to become more visible in the public sphere. These were the titles of those newspapers with their respective publication dates. Suara Perempuan, 1918, Johara Untuk Bangsa Perempuan, 1923, Ajrak, 1923 to 1925, Suara Kaum Ibu Sumatra, 1925 to 1929, Medan Poetry, 1933, Menara Poetry, 1938 to 1939, Suara Kaum Ibu Suomunja, 1938, and Soenting Melajoe, 1912 to 1921. Most of these titles were directly related to women, for example, Suara Perempuan, Voice of Women. Soenting Melajoe was a bit different. Bronwyn Jones writes that it was very likely a pun. Soenting Melajoe translated into Malay headdress, as in worn by women, but it could also mean editing Malay, as in referring to its intentions to reform gender expectations. Hanani writes, quote, "The presence of women's newspapers can be considered as a form of welfare movement inseparable from the marginalized condition of women, illustrated by various stories told in the newspapers. Under these conditions, there was a sense of discomfort and desire to escape from such situations. One of the ways to achieve it was to publicize the writings about the sufferings." Unquote. The most common theme in women's newspapers was, logically, the injustices being committed against them. For example, inequality with men in education, economics, politics, and other fields. They were being left behind in the progress that the nation was already experiencing. Soenting Melajoe was the first of these newspapers, and it ran the longest. It ran for almost a decade, in fact. Here are some of the titles published by the newspaper from 1912 to 1913. Our Nation Suppressed Women, The Goodness of Women Going to School, The Fate of Women Who Are Not Respected by Men, and The Thoughts of My Nation's Women. As we discussed in the previous episode, Ruhana Kuddus established Soenting Melajoe in 1912 after a correspondence with Dato' Sultan Maharaja, the editor-in-chief of another newspaper, Utusan Melajoe. Its first editors were Ruhana Kuddus and Ratna Juwita, both women from West Sumatra. Ratna Juwita worked there until 1917 and was actually the daughter of Dato' Sultan Maharaja. Dato' Sultan Maharaja is a very interesting figure too, as he was the leader of the Young Malay Group, a political cultural movement that pushed for kemajuan or progress in modernity. He had a rival newspaper at the time, Al Munir. He created 2 other newspapers to beat Al Munir out of circulation. These newspapers were called Sulu Melayu, Malay Torch, and Suara Melayu, Malay Voice. He advocated for girls and encouraged the parents to realize the importance of education. He also built weaving schools for girls in Padang with the idea that progress and women's welfare could be attained by reviving the Minangkabau legacy. So it seems only natural that such a figure would have a hand in making the first women's newspaper come to life. Soenting Melajoe definitely wasn't just ink on paper. It served as a powerful call to action for the women of Minangkabau society. In the words of contributor Ruhina, a native of the Durian sub-district in Sahualunto City, quote, "Let all of us, women, as soldiers, faithfully follow our two editors as our generals on the battlefield, and Soenting Melayu is our war banner. Unquote. The writers of Soenting Melayu came from diverse backgrounds, from the bustling port cities to the heart of the coffee country. Some learned to read and write in schools, while others gained knowledge from family members. Herawati et al. Have a fantastic article on the profiles of the women writers of Soenting Melayu, of which there were 587. It's absolutely remarkable that we have the opinions of over 500 women from that time, forever immortalized through Soenting Melayu. So, who were they? Most of the women writers' family backgrounds are Dutch government employees, ranging from prosecutors, Javanese doctors, clerks, supervisors, managers, cooks, even station employees. The second most common family background was teachers, principals, or retired teachers. For a few, their families belonged to the heads of the region, such as village heads. The editors of Soenting Melayu, other than Ruhana Kuddus, who we already met, also deserve plenty of attention. In August 1917, after Ratna Juwita left her post, a new co-editor came in, Siti Nurma, also from Kotogadang. Nurma was a student of Datu Sultan Maharaja, could write in both Dutch and Arabic, was a skilled weaver, and once gave a speech in fluent Dutch at the celebration of Princess Juliana's 5th birthday in front of the Dutch governor. In October 1917, they welcomed another editor, Amna. She was the daughter of a principal of a school in Bengkulu and was in fact only one of a handful of women from Bengkulu who were able to go to school at the time. The reason being, again, because only men needed to learn. Because of being told that from a young age, it stuck with her and she often wrote about it. She called on Bengkulu leaders to facilitate women's learning and skills. When a school was finally established, she requested that a night market week, like the one in Minangkabau, be held in Bengkulu as a forum for exhibitions of the skills of their female students. Based on the articles in Soenting Melayu, the night market was a success and many women appreciated her advocacy. The cool thing about this was that Amna was just 18 years old in 1917. The next editor was Siti Jatia, who joined them in May 1918. Unlike the others, Siti Jatia did not go to school at all. But after her marriage to a Datu Oraju Nando, she learned to read and write. Herawati et al. Write that it was not uncommon for Minangkabau women at the time to learn reading and writing from their husbands. Jatia wrote poetry for the newspaper on top of 28 other articles. Sadly, she passed away in 1920, but she was replaced by her sister, Siti Nosia. Besides the editors, there are a couple more women contributors who we know a little about. There was Siti Sundari Dharmabroto, who published 2 articles in Soenting Melayu in defense of women, education, marriage, and culture. Quote, "And parents ought to give permission to daughters who wanted to seek intelligence. Do not let girls be locked up again in a cage like wild birds, never taken out of the house if not married. Girls ought to be taught as boys, otherwise the girls would not be happy in this world." Siti Sundari Dharmabroto, Soenting Melayu. A lot of this actually reminds me of episode 16, Girlhood in American Colonial Manila, where the writings in the magazines we talked about mirror these thoughts. Like we said, many editors and contributors came from privileged backgrounds. Siti Sundari Dharmabroto was the daughter of a school principal who was fluent in Dutch, and she also spoke some English. She was actually one of the editors of the Javanese women's magazine, Vanita Suaro. Siti Sundari established a girls' school in Java and represented Javanese women in the first Colonial Teaching Congress in The Hague in 1916. We also know some other contributors like Hamida, the daughter of a prosecutor in Sahualunto, and Putri, the wife of Datu Baginda, a teacher. Putri also accessed education later in life, learning to read and write after her domestic chores. Soenting Melayu reached far and wide. Contributors came from nearby regions of Kayutanam, Padang, Mangalalumpong, as well as Ruhana Kuddus' hometown of Kotogadang. Some women sent in articles from more remote areas like Pulau Banyak and Singkilache, 37 kilometers from mainland Sumatra. Outside Sumatra, some writers came from Sulawesi, Kalimantan, Java, and even Malaysia and the Netherlands. Scholar Bronwyn Jones wrote that Soenting Melayu was, quote, a unique forum for women to pose normative questions concerning morality, womanhood, and power relations, and to protest against inequalities that they faced. It provides a window into women's concerns, experiences, and emotions in poetry and prose. Contributors conceptualize their place in families and communities as both powerful and marginal, complicating an enduring colonially constructed discourse on their empowerment in Minangkabau matriarchy. Unquote. Shout out to Bronwyn Jones for introducing me to Soenting Melajoe, by the way. I hope we can get an interview with her one day. The last edition of Soenting Melajoe was labeled Year 10, Edition 4, dated January 28, 1921. This was because in February 1921, Soenting Melajoe's printing company went on strike. That wasn't the end for women's newspapers, though, as other publications and writers carried on the torch and have continued to write about women's issues since. Thank you for listening to episode 26, the Soenting Melajoe newspaper, 1912 to 1921. Thank you to our patrons, Geraineon, Lawrence, Beverly, Xiaomei by Milish, Jennifer, Christina, Raymond, Matt, Ashley, Asha, Chanda, and Yati. For more Her Story Southeast Asia, head on over to Patreon where as little as $1 can get you access to the following bonus episodes. An interview with Haldi Patra on the Minangkabau Matriarchal Society, Maying Taphan and the Krom Klone, Pinate, the Harbor Master of Gresik, Queen Suriyotay and the War Elephants, Paz Marquez Benitez and Dead Stars, The Rise and Fall of the Achinese Queens, 1641 to 1699, The Portrait of Dararasami, The Women of Number 14 Libulith, and the upcoming episode on Burmese journalists Dudu Dawamar and Mama Lay. Along with the bonus episodes, you get access to full scripts and reference materials. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook Threads and Instagram at Her Story CPod. That's Her Story, SEA Pod. This podcast was hosted and edited by Agas Ramirez. Maraming salamat!